And as you can see, here white is preparing for castle, but here Kasparov decides to just slide his king to f8, defending this queen, and in the next move, black is going to push this pawn to c4, which will cover the diagonal of this light square bishop. And the best way for white to tackle this is simply pushing b3 so that black cannot push this c pawn further, but instead he decides to capture this pawn on c5. And here white is threatening to play knight to c6, which will attack this queen, and also black has the threat of this back rank mate, so that's why to tackle this, firstly Kasparov decides to slide his king to g8. And as you can see, now white completely takes over the a file, and now this pawn is ready to be pushed. Knight to c5, a good move by Kasparov. Basically, he wants to place this knight to e4 so that this rook can target this f2 pawn if the bishop moves. And the easiest way to tackle this is simply queen to a3, attacking this rook, and now black is forced to go back to any of these squares. This is because suppose if black is not careful and he decides to go to this d2 square, then that will be a huge blunder due to queen to b4, and now you can see this rook gets completely trapped by this queen. Okay, so in the actual game, after knight to c5, here white decides to give a check from the a8 square. And now comes the most interesting part of this game. Basically, in this position, here Garry Kasparov decides to sacrifice his bishop by bishop to a4. But why? This is because after bishop takes a4, now comes rook to a6, attacking this queen as well as this bishop. And after queen to b5, simply rook takes a4. And basically, Kasparov does all of this because he wants to take complete control over this a file, which he successfully does in the game. And as you can see, now white is threatening to bring this queen to e8 so that he can create some pressure over this f7 pawn. So that's why after seeing this, here Kasparov decides to bring back his rook to a7, adding an extra defense to this f7 pawn. But however, here white goes for queen to e8. Okay, and after that, rook to b7, asking for rook exchange, but instead rook to b4 by white. Basically, he wants to bring this rook to h4 with the idea of queen to f8, targeting this h6 pawn. And suppose to defend this, if black decides to exchange the rooks by rook takes a4, then after takes, simply knight to e4. Okay, if b5, knight to c5, queen to c6, asking for queen exchange, and if black blunders by exchanging the queens, and by this, now you can see white successfully creates a passer on the c file. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move rook to b4, so that's why here Kasparov decides to slide his king to g7, getting out from any danger, and which also stops the move queen to f8. And now it's better for white to focus on pushing this a pawn, but instead he made a mistake by playing g3. And the problem with that move is now black can bring his knight to d3, which attacks this rook as well as support this c pawn further in the game. And suppose if game continues like rook takes b7, then after queen takes b7, now black is threatening to give a check from b1 square. So suppose to stop this, if he brings his knight to b4, creating a blockade. Now I just want you all to pause the video and try to find the crushing move which black can play in this position. Okay, so let me give you a hint. Basically, in this position, you have to somehow promote this c pawn. So let's suppose if black decides to capture this knight on b4 by knight takes b4. And now here, white cannot capture this knight on b4 because then black will easily promote the pawn. And since the c8 square is already covered by this queen, so that's why the only move for white is to bring this queen to e5, giving a check and also targeting this pawn on c3. And after this king moves, simply queen takes c3, knight to c6, defending this knight. Although white is a knight down, but this game is still holdable for white because suppose if black make any mistake in the future, but we have to somehow promote this pawn. So that's why let me go back to knight to b4. So the only move in which black can promote this pawn is to sacrifice this queen by queen takes b4. And suppose if takes, now comes c2. And suppose if queen to c6, simply c1 equal to queen takes, and clearly you can see this position is completely winning for black. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move g3, so that's why, but instead here Kasparov goes for knight to e6. He missed this amazing opportunity. And now it's important for white to bring this queen to d3 so that he can keep an eye over this c3 pawn. But instead, he made a mistake by queen to b6, attacking this rook. But the problem with that move is, now in this position, Kasparov finds the best move, queen to f5, targeting this pawn on f2, and here white cannot capture this rook because if queen takes a7, queen takes f2 check, king to h3, and finally queen takes g3 checkmate. So that's why after queen to f5, here white pushed f3, attacking this knight, and after that Kasparov brings back his knight to g5, attacking this knight. But rook to b1 might be the better option for white so that he can somehow try to stop this c-pawn from promotion. And in this position, Luc Winants resigned because, as you can see, now no one can stop this c pawn from promotion because this c4 square is already covered by this pawn in which this rook can't enter. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.